The unsolved murder that made this inbred boy famous. On the 4th of April, 1922, 6 bodies were discovered on a small Bavarian farm known as Hinterkaifeck, about 40 miles north of Munich. It was a tragic and shockingly brutal event. But if that's where the story ended, I probably wouldn't be making a video about it 100 years later. But first, I want to ask you a question. What would you do if you heard strange noises coming from your attic? Well, that's exactly what Hinterkaifeck's Live and Made reported about 6 months before the murders. Old farmhouses aren't exactly known for being quiet places, but these sounds were different, disturbing even. Footsteps, scratching, tapping. It was almost as though someone was secretly living in the attic. That someone, if he or she ever existed, was never found. But the maid was so frightened she quit her job on the spot, never to return. Fast forward 6 months to just a few days before the murders, and the farm's owner, a man called Andreas Gruber, found a set of footprints in the snow leading from the nearby forest to the farm. Again, a search of the premises didn't turn up any mischievous murderers playing the world's least funny game of hide and seek. But they didn't find any footprints leading away from the farm either. That night, the entire family heard strange noises coming from the attic, and the following day, Andreas Gruber noticed that one of his house keys had gone missing. A few days later, on the 31st of March, Maria Baumgartner arrived at Hinterkaifeck. She was to be the Gruber family's new maid. You know, to replace the one that quit her job in terror 6 months earlier. Yeah, I'm guessing they didn't mention that in the interview. We've all heard horror stories about bad first days at work. You might have one or two yourself, but I don't think anyone can top Maria Baumgartner's, because that very night she and all 5 of her new employers were brutally murdered. Exactly what happened is still unknown, but from what we can tell, the murderer hid in the barn, then somehow led 4 members of the Gruber family to his location one by one. Andreas Gruber, his wife Kazilia, their daughter Victoria Gabriel, and her daughter, also called Kazilia, were later found dead on the floor of the barn. Their bodies were stacked on top of each other. From there, the killer moved into the farmhouse, where he murdered the new maid in her bedroom. 2-year-old Joseph Gabriel, Victoria's youngest child, was found dead in his cot. All 6 of the victims were killed in the same way, bludgeoned over the head with a blunt object. There was also evidence that meals had been prepared and consumed in the farm's kitchen. Considering all members of the Gruber family were well and truly dead at this point, there's only one real conclusion we can come to here. After murdering 6 people in cold blood, the killer continued to live on the property with his victims for 4 days, just being a farmer. The things people did before Stardew Valley. It was he, along with his friends Michael Plockel and Jacob Sigel, who first found their bodies on the afternoon of the 4th of April. They'd gone to check on the family after realizing nobody had seen them for several days. Rumor has it Schlittenbauer was in a relationship with one of the victims, Victoria, but the real reason police suspected he was involved is because, according to official statements from Plockel and Sigel, he acted bloody weird when he found the bodies. The first course of action for most people upon finding 4 dead bodies piled up in a barn would be to throw up all over their shoes. Not Lauren Schlittenbauer. Nope. He decided to move them around a bit to get a better look at them, apparently showing no particularly strong emotions. He then headed into the farmhouse, unlocking the front door with a key he produced from his pocket. Plockel and Sigel tried to stop him because they shouldn't disturb any evidence that might be useful to the police. But Schlittenbauer ignored them and just went in alone. When the police did finally show up the following day, he was even kind enough to present them with what he thought was the murder weapon, a pickaxe he found in the barn. I can only assume he was either very naive or very, very guilty. He was later questioned by the police for obvious reasons, but he justified his undeniably odd behavior by claiming he'd been frantically searching for his son. And this is where things start to get a bit complicated. Well, more complicated. You see, the paternity of 2-year-old Joseph Gabriel, the youngest victim, is unclear. His mother, Victoria, had been widowed 8 years earlier when her husband, Karl, died fighting in the First World War. Either way, there's another strong contender for Joseph's father, Andreas Gruber. Yeah, that's Victoria's dad. It was well known in the local community that Andreas and Victoria were involved in an incestuous relationship. They'd even been forced to deny it in court. Their accuser? Lauren Schlittenbauer. I told you it was complicated. Schlittenbauer eventually dropped those charges, and it seems that they all kissed and made up afterward. Sorry, poor choice of words there. But when he later asked permission to take Victoria's hand in marriage, Andres Gruber refused. Yeah, I don't know why he wanted to marry the woman he thought was sleeping with her father either. It's all one big incestuous mess, and we'll likely never know all the details. The important thing here is that there may well have been a pretty powerful motive for murder buried in there somewhere. Did Lawrence Schlittenbauer believe Joseph was his, only to find out Andreas was the father? It's certainly possible. Add that to the other evidence against him, and it isn't hard to see why Schlittenbauer was suspect number one. But question marks remain. Arguably the most compelling evidence against him is the fact he seems to have had a key to the Gruber house, the same key that went missing shortly before the murders. Some people argue that Andres Gruber may have given it to Schlittenbauer so he could check up on the family from time to time. But others have pointed out that he could only have had the key if he was in the house or very nearby at the time of the murders. This is circumstantial. But then again, so is all of the evidence in this case. At the time, the police decided they didn't have enough to bring formal charges, but modern crime historians are pretty sure Lawrence Schlittenbauer was the murderer. The thing is, though, not all of them are. Enter Paul Muller. If you've read The Man from the Train by Bill James and Rachel McCarthy James, you may well have heard of Paul Muller before. If you haven't, here's a quick rundown. Between 1898 and 1912, Muller is thought to have committed a series of gruesome murders across the United States. These were brutal and bizarre killings, usually targeting whole families who lived in remote houses on the outskirts of small towns. His modus operandi, if you will, was to kill his victims by bludgeoning them with the blunt side of an axe. After the murders, he usually stayed in their homes for a few days, eating their food and sleeping in their beds. This was back in the days when most people didn't lock their doors, so it was easy for Muller to slip into homes unnoticed. If that sounds familiar to you, well, it should. It's almost exactly what happened at Hinterkaifeck. The only real differences are that the victims at Hinterkaifeck were killed with a pickaxe rather than a regular axe, and of course, it took place in Germany, not the United States. But if you're thinking a guy like Muller wouldn't have traveled halfway across the world to murder a bunch of people on a small farm, then think again. There's some evidence he may have fled the US in 1912 after a particularly gruesome murder, and his whereabouts afterward are unknown. It's even possible he went on to kill a bunch more people in Denmark and Switzerland, although those murders are unsolved too. The thing is, by the time 1922 rolled around, Paul Muller would have been at least 50 years old. Not impossible to carry out a brutal murder spree, but it does make it less likely. Also, to be honest with you, we don't even know for sure if Paul Muller existed, let alone that he murdered a bunch of people in Germany. He may well have just been a figment of a crime historian's imagination. So if not Schlittenbauer or Muller, who else could have done it? There are a couple of other suspects, but none of them have particularly strong evidence against them. A few years later, the police arrested two brothers named Adolf and Anton Gump. A former friend of the brothers said Adolf had confessed to the murders before he died. Both men were eventually released due to a lack of evidence, though. It's worth noting that at the time of the Hinterkaifeck murders, Anton Gump was in the military, stationed over 200 miles away. Another suspect is Peter Weber, a man who fought alongside Victoria's dead husband in the First World War. It's said he and Victoria had been having an affair, and he convinced her to give him a large sum of money before the murders. Again, though, there's no real evidence to tie him to the scene. Ultimately, after 100 years, we're probably never going to find out exactly what happened on that remote Bavarian farm. All we can say for sure is that 6 innocent people were brutally murdered, and their killer may well have lived among them for days afterward. Did you like it? Tell us what you think of the video in the comments section below. And don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more interesting videos.